Hello, and welcome to Designing for Care and Embracing Ungrading with Jessie Stommel. I'm Lauren Whitby, the Marketing Communications Specialist Senior at ASU's Institute for Humanities Research. We're so pleased to have you all join us today for this important event, which we hope will provide our viewers in the ASU community and beyond with some of the tools you need to designing for care and with some of the tools you need to build just, inclusive, and compassionate learning environments. Before I introduce our moderator, I have a few housekeeping items to address. You've perhaps noticed that chat has been disabled for this event. To pose a question for our speaker today, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window or in the YouTube chat if you are viewing this lecture on YouTube. We'll help relay those questions to our moderator to be addressed during the Q&A portion of the event. Please feel free to pose a question at any time during the event, and the sooner we get your question, the more likely we will be able to answer it. Just as a note to our Zoom audience, we have our behind the scenes team here, and some of us will be keeping our camera on to give Dr. Stommel an audience via Zoom. He has requested to not speak into the webinar void today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Asao Inoue, who will be our moderator for this event. Dr. Inouye is a professor and the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Integrative Sciences and Arts at Arizona State University. His research focuses on anti-racist and social justice theory and practices in writing assessments. He was the 2019 chair of the Conference on College Composition and Communication and has been a past member of the 4Cs Executive Committee and the Executive Board of the Council of Writing Program Administrators. Among his many articles and chapters on writing assessment, race, and racism, his article, Theorizing Failure in U.S. Writing Assessments in Research in the Teaching of English, won the 2014 CWPA Outstanding Scholarship Award. His co-edited collection, Race and Writing Assessment, won the 2014 NCTE 4Cs Outstanding Book Award for an edited collection. His book, Anti-Racist Writing Assessment Ecologies, Teaching and Assessing for a Socially Just Future, won the 2017 NCTE and 4Cs Outstanding Book Award for a monograph and the 2015 CWPA Outstanding Book Award. He has also published a co-edited collection, Writing Assessment, Social Justice, and the Advancement of Opportunity, and a book, Labor-Based Grading Contracts, Building Equity and Inclusion in the Compassionate Writing Classroom. Dr. Inouye, I will now turn the time over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And thank you everyone for coming and joining us to engage. I hope you'll have lots of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can when the time comes. And I want to also say on a personal note, very excited. I've been excited for a couple of weeks to be able to do this with Jessie because I very much am honored to be able to introduce and perhaps engage a little bit with Jessie. So the way it will work is Jessie will have a kind of a presentation and discuss, and I may engage a little bit, but I'll leave most of that time for him in the first half an hour, and then we'll move into a conversation to make it a bit dynamic, and we'll enter your questions at that time, and he and I will have a conversation about your questions. So let me introduce our guest. Dr. Jessie Stommel is co-founder of Digital Pedagogy Lab and co-founder and executive director of Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy. As an example of how innovative and important his work has been, the Digital Pedagogy Lab is much more than an international conference. It's a classroom, a laboratory for teachers, a cohorted space for innovating, teaching, and assessing along 13 tracks, ones such as action and change and open dialogue, critical pedagogy and storytelling, embodiment in digital pedagogy, inclusive design and design justice in practice, and social justice and the curriculum. His teaching and scholarship ranges from higher education pedagogy, open pedagogy, grading and assessment, critical digital pedagogy, learning interfaces, documentary film, new media, public humanities, scholarly publishing, Shakespeare, horror, science fiction, and queer theory. Dr. Stommel earned his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. He has won numerous awards, grants, and fellowships for his teaching and scholarship over the years. He's published a book, An Urgency of Teachers, the Work of Critical Digital Pedagogy, and a co-edited collection, Disrupting the Digital Humanities. Additionally, he's written 37 articles, books, chapters, and electronic publications, as well as co-authored a textbook, Virtual Shakespeare. He's done numerous keynotes, plenaries, and many media appearances, way too many to count. And if all that wasn't enough, Dr. Stommel is also a documentary filmmaker, senior lecturer, and digital learning fellow for communication and digital studies at the University of Mary Washington. His Twitter account has more than 31,000 followers. How does an academic get that many followers? The answer is be Jesse Stommel. Now, needless to say, I've been a big fan of his for some time and have the pleasure to be on a few panels with him. He never disappoints. He is always impressive, and I'm honored to introduce my friend, Dr. Jesse Stommel. Take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, for the wonderful introduction. I will just say that speaking with you today, and I think I've said this before when we were together, is sort of like hanging out with one of my heroes. Truthfully, there aren't many people really pushing as hard as we are in this space. There are definitely others, but I feel like I've watched you push for years, and it has always encouraged me to push harder and to do better work. And I thank you for that so much. I am delighted to hang out with you all today. And ultimately happy to hang out with the ASU community, but also happy to hang out with all of the other people who are coming and joining us today. It was interesting, you said something about how it is that I have a following of 31,000 people on Twitter. I have really no idea. I'm actually a closet introvert, and I taught for 12 years before I spoke really publicly about my pedagogy at all. And ultimately what happened for me was that I felt like I was resting on my laurels to some extent. Like I had been teaching 12 years and I needed a push myself. So in some ways, I came out and started speaking more publicly about my pedagogical approach as a way not necessarily to proselytize for my own approach, but as a way to have all the folks who responded push back on me and ask me to be better and ask me to work harder. And that's what I continue to do to this day is, and I've been fascinated, and I may talk about this a little bit as we talk about grading and assessment today. I've been amazed at how much my teaching has changed in the last 2 years. I've been teaching for 21 years, and the pandemic and the response to the pandemic and the failures in the response to the pandemic and the amazing things that I've seen people do in the last year have pushed me in ways that I haven't been pushed in years, pushed me to think about my students in different ways, and also the challenges that I've seen students facing and the challenges I've seen my colleagues face have helped me realize how hard the work that we do is, and also how much work there was that was needing to be done 5 years, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that we're only just surfacing now. So I'm going to share my slides and dive in, but I welcome you or folks in the Q&A to jump in with questions now. We'll circle around and talk about them, but feel free.
As you're doing that, Jesse, let me just
Yes.
say your initial comments made me wonder, do you think today, given like in this moment in pandemic where most of the higher education teaching is done remotely and even secondary teaching is done remotely, that that more teachers are finding themselves in a situation like yours that is broadcasting and more digital than they've ever been in the classroom?
I think affordance in the sense that we're having conversations that we didn't necessarily have, and having those conversations in public and increasingly public forums that we might not have had. If I was on campus at ASU for this particular presentation, it might have had a much more localized audience, but the way that we're now doing this essentially allows us to blur the lines between what is ASU, what is beyond ASU, what is my space, what is your space. I think that is really productive for the conversation. The other thing, and this is something I'll talk about in my presentation, is that I think that a lot of trauma is being unearthed in the last year. Trauma that we're currently experiencing, but chronic trauma that people have been experiencing all along, that we're just making sense of and starting to grapple with. Because in a way, we're all experiencing the shared collective sense of trauma, which sadly, I think, allows us to see traumas that people were experiencing prior to the pandemic better than we were before. I think there's a way in which we were in a bit of a privileged box that has been exploded. And now all of us sitting together in this muck, trying to figure out how to move through it. And I guess I would say that my hope is that we don't pivot, back to business as usual tomorrow, July, August, when we reach herd immunity, when 4,000 people a day stop dying. I hope that we don't pivot back to business as usual, because I don't think business as usual was serving the people that we most need to serve. There, I just gave my entire presentation in answer to that question. I don't need these slides at all. So I want to start with the quote from Mahabali. It's 4 words here, 4 words which I find perplexing, wonderful, inspiring, troubling, hard, challenging. And she writes, love first, design later. This was one of many responses that I got years ago to a prompt that I created called forward pedagogy, #4word pedagogy, which was inspired by the idea of a 6-word story. Could we take our pedagogy and reduce it to the germ of just 4 words? I have literary scholar training. And so to me, close reading and the power of words to be expansive, to do so much more than what we think one word might otherwise be able to do. And what I find so wonderful about these words from her is the way that every time I look at them, I think about them slightly differently, and they challenge me in new ways. And what I've been asking myself to do is take words of wisdom like this, words of wisdom that are very personal for her, that aren't necessarily meant to proselytize or be a set of best practices, and hold them against my pedagogical approaches and think, to what extent am I doing this? To what extent am I following the lead of really this sort of amazing scholar and teacher? This is from a quote from a piece by me and Sarah Goldrick-Rab. I've known Sarah for, I believe, about 9 years. She focuses on higher education policy. I focus on higher education pedagogy. Her focus is specifically on college affordability, food insecurity, housing insecurity, and how the sort of policy approaches that we need to use to address some of those problems. When I met Sarah and started working with her, immediately I felt this challenge of, okay, if is a policy response to her work, to the recognition that our students are facing food insecurity, housing insecurity, chronic illness, disability, what is the pedagogical response? And I think too seldomly do we really think about who our students are, as opposed to who we want them to be. And that's what this quote is about. That's what this inspired in me, is to think about that. She writes, today's college students are the most overburdened and undersupported in American history. More than 1 in 4 have a child, almost 3 in 4 are employed, and more than half receive Pell Grants, but are left far short of the funds required to pay for college. A few more highlights from her work and what it has unearthed. According to the Hope Center's National Real College Survey, out of 86,000 students surveyed, 56% were housing insecure in the previous year, and 17% were homeless. This means 1 in 2 of the students were facing some level of housing insecurity in the previous year. She has found something similar with food insecurity, that 1 in 2 students have faced food insecurity in the last 30 days. LGBTQ young adults had a 120% higher risk of reporting homelessness compared to youth who identified as heterosexual and cisgender. And these are some data that go back even further, because if we think about who our students are now, we also have to think about who our students have been and how they've grown up in our educational systems. Black girls are 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended. While Black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers, they make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. I actually got a chill up my spine. I've talked about this a lot, and every time I read that piece of data, I get a chill up my spine. I have a daughter. She's 4 years old. She's Black. She has 2 gay dads. She's adopted. She is growing up in the educational system where this statistic is true. And I think about not only the likelihood that she will experience that, but how that will ripple out and influence her education, how that will change the person who comes to her college professor and talks to them about their experience in college. And if I think about something like ungrading, if I think about something like grading and assessment in college, and I think about this kind of data and how this data ends up changing all of the things that we do throughout our system. Another piece of data here, teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students. They also are more likely to interrupt girls. When teachers ask questions, they direct their gaze towards boys more often, especially when questions are open-ended. Something that I'm going to circle around in this presentation is the idea that we don't always assess what we say we want to assess. What we find out here is that, in fact, later in college life, what we might actually be assessing was whether or not that student was, in fact, a Black preschooler, whether or not that student had been suspended as a Black girl, whether or not that student was not getting eye contact from their professor because they were a girl. We need to design our pedagogical approaches for the students we have, not the students we wish we had. This requires approaches that are responsive, inclusive, adaptive, challenging, and compassionate. This is not a theoretical exercise, it is a practical one. This is from Sarah Goldrick-Rabb and I's article that we wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, teaching the students we have, not the students we wish we had. This to me was a charge. Writing this piece, I've been quoting from it for the last 2 years because writing this piece with her has called me to do my work differently. And I keep putting these words in my presentation because I keep feeling called to work harder, to do better. We have to design for the least privileged, most marginalized students, the ones more likely to have felt isolated even before the pandemic: disabled students, chronically ill students, Black students, Indigenous students, LGBTQ students. We need to write policies, design assessments, imagine new ways forward for the students already struggling, already facing exclusion. So inclusivity in higher education. I've given presentations on this prior to the pandemic. This is one of the slides from one of those presentations. These are some of the things I suggested. Walk campus to access accessibility of common spaces in classrooms. Accessible desks in every classroom don't do much good if students can't get to them because the rooms are overcrowded. Invite students to share their pronouns, model this behavior, but don't expect it of everyone. Not all students will feel equally safe sharing pronouns. Make sure there is an easy and advertised process for students, faculty, and staff to change their names in institutional systems. Regularly invite campus community into hard conversations about inclusivity. For example, frank discussions of gender and race bias in grading and course evaluations. What does it look to do this work online? How do we walk our virtual campuses to address accessibility concerns? Where do we hold the necessary town hall meetings to address hard questions about inclusivity? How do we connect students learning on ground to students who can only learn online? What kinds of decisions must we make to ensure access for students or teachers who become sick? Over the last year, and I've seen this conversation emerging over the last several months, I've heard people talking about compassionate grading policies, changing the way that they approach grades to address the inequities that the COVID pandemic has unearthed. There was a lot of conversation around this back in March, April, and May of last year. What I've noticed is that institutions had some really great ideas, tried some interesting things, overloaded students with bureaucracy in order to get the kind of accommodation that they needed from their institutions, and that they very quickly started to pivot back to business as usual when it comes to grades and assessment. The institution where I was at in March and April of last year, University of Mary Washington, came up with a pandemic response in their assessment approach, a compassionate grading policy where they would allow students to opt into pass-fail for all of their courses. And they allowed students to do that up until the very last minute. The problems with this for me was that the status quo option was still grades. Students actually had to go through a bureaucratic process to opt into pass-fail or opt into a compassionate grading policy. One of the deep problems with this is that the students most likely to be marginalized are least likely to seek out the accommodations and are least likely to feel comfortable going through the bureaucratic processes. There's also a way in which just going through those processes demonizes those students, makes them feel as though they're a failure, makes them feel as though they're making a choice that, and gosh, even as I say that, I have to stop myself. This moment is not a choice for students facing serious problems. And I think that the ways that I've seen education as a system pivoting back to business as usual as quickly as it possibly could, or even hoping and imagining that they could pivot back, have been pretty disturbing to me. So designing for care, I've got some principles here for designing for care. I'm not a fan of best practices. Ultimately, I think we need idiosyncratic practices. We need best practices for your particular context with your students in your environment. So I'm not going to give you like, here's the top 10 things you can do tomorrow to change how you do assessment in your classroom. But some principles instead that underlie the approaches that I've taken. Flexibility and trust are key principles of any pedagogy, but they are particularly important when we're in crisis. This was my response to the forward pedagogy, and it has also continued to challenge me to this day. At the moment, it was somewhat flip. Oh, I've got to take my whole pedagogy and put it into 4 words. I've just asked other people to do this, so now I need to figure out how to do it myself. These were the words that came out almost impulsively in the moment. And yet they've also stuck with me. Start by trusting students. What does that look like? What does it look like to put trust into our processes, into our pedagogies, into our policies, into our design of our courses? What does it look like to bake that in? And when and how are we not? And in fact, doing the opposite. So if you Google, is cheating on the rise? You find a half dozen articles like this one from the Washington Post, which actually cites data reported by ProctorU about the rise of online cheating. I won't share that data because it seems journalistically irresponsible that the Washington Post would use ProctorU, a company that profits off of the cheating industry, if you will, that they would use data from ProctorU to support an argument that cheating is on the rise. Of course, ProctorU wants us all to think that cheating is on the rise because they profit off of us thinking and believing that cheating is on the rise. If we actually look at the data, in fact, we find out that cheating isn't on the rise, that if anything, cheating has been slightly declining over the last 50 years. There's still a lot of cheating. As you see from this data, in 1963, Bowers surveyed roughly 100 institutions and found that 75% of the surveyed students admitted to cheating at least once in their college careers. McCabe et al. In 2012, in the book Cheating in College, includes findings from 150,000 students recently surveyed, showing that between 60 to 70% of the respondents admitted to cheating. So it's, if anything, staying the same or slightly declining. It's a lot of cheating, but ultimately, I would argue that this has less to do with a desire to cheat and more to do with the pedagogical approaches we're using to engage students. This is a bit of a mini thesis inside of this. I wish I could come back and give a whole presentation on the surveillance industry and the surveillance tech industry. I'm happy to do that. Hopefully I can come hang out with you all in person at that point. We shouldn't trust for-profit tech companies more than we trust our own students. Remote proctoring tools can't ensure that students won't cheat. Turnitin won't make students better writers. The LMS can't ensure students will learn. All will, however, ensure that students and teachers feel more thoroughly policed. One of the things I've been most disturbed to watch over the course of the pandemic is very large investments in proctoring software and plagiarism tech. Because if you Google, is plagiarism on the rise in the age of the internet? You'll come up with another 10 articles, all arguing that it is, which in fact are suspect. And in fact, if you dig deeper, you'll discover that no, plagiarism isn't actually on the rise, but instead the culture of suspicion around plagiarism is what we see on the rise, fueled by the people who are profiting off of that particular culture. So what I've watched is I've watched institutions. So the state of Illinois recently created a contract, which was $25 million for a multi-year contract for a proctoring solution and $25 million for a plagiarism detection software. Multi-year contract renewable at $22 million for subsequent contracts. And I look at those numbers, $50 million spent on surveillance tech. And I wonder what would happen if we had spent that money on faculty development, helping teachers and supporting teachers as they think of new ways to approach students and to work with students. What if we had taken that $50 million and put it towards student support to help students feel better able and capable to do the work within their courses, as opposed to making them feel like they're cheaters and essentially pricing them out of college, as some of the data from Sarah Goldrick-Rab indicates. So here's some good for some people in some context practices that work, I think, much, much better than surveillance tech. Create multiple points of entry. This next one, start with hello, how are you, has been something that I've been thinking a lot about. I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we front bureaucracy in our interactions with students, in the ways that we build support pages, in the way that we build accommodation policies, in the way that we build syllabi, course websites, where they privilege the bureaucracies of teaching and learning as opposed to the human relationships and human interactions that are at the center, at the heart of what we do in education. So start with hello, how are you for me began as look at the top of your syllabus. What's at the top of your syllabus? Is it a bunch of administrivia? Is it bureaucratic details? Is it stuff about where you'll meet? Is it the course codes? Or is it the words, hello, how are you? And how do we either literally or metaphorically move hello, how are you up to the top of our interactions that we have with students? I remember when I first started teaching that my first interaction with my students was to hand them a paper syllabus as they walked into the course, into the classroom, and literally look them in the eye and say hello. Now they encounter me through the learning management system, through the agreement that they have to make with the proctoring software. Luckily, I haven't taught at an institution where I've been required to use proctoring software, but I know many teachers are. I think this third piece is what I find most important, especially when we're talking about assessment. Remind students a rug won't get pulled out from under them. Remind them again and again. One of the big issues with using alternative assessment approaches is that students are often afraid that we don't really mean it. That we don't really mean that we aren't going to subject them to the status quo and the bureaucratic hurdles they've dealt with before. I'm going to go ahead and move past this slide. And the next piece here is that we must be willing to acknowledge trauma members of our community have and will experience. There's robust evidence that social isolation and loneliness significantly increase risk for premature mortality, and the magnitude of the risk exceeds that of many leading health indicators. So this moment, and the things that led up to this moment are having an effect on student performance, but they're also having an effect on their lifespan, how long they're likely to live. I'm not going to go through everything here, but this is a really useful resource for folks. It's a trauma-informed approach to teaching through the coronavirus from Teaching Tolerance. Along with these 4 bits of advice, it's a long, very nuanced piece, which I highly recommend. Our ability to develop community will depend on our willingness to continue feeling joy, having epiphanies, asking hard questions, and sharing our curiosity with one another. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool optimist. I've found it really hard over the last year to continue being optimistic. So recognizing and acknowledging that it's important for us to address trauma, address the fact that trauma is not distributed equally, as I say here, but also to recognize the importance of hope and joy. Bell Hooks writes quite a bit about this idea of love and this idea of joy. How do we take something like joy, or as Mahabali wrote, love, and how do we build those into our assessment strategies? And this sort of getting to the crux of what we're probably going to continue talking about for the next 45 minutes, we need to give students reasons less banal than points to do the work of learning. Assessment tends so much to drive and control teaching. Much of what we do in the classroom is determined by the assessment structures we work under. Research shows 3 reliable effects when students are graded. They tend to think less deeply, avoid taking risks, and lose interest in learning itself. Most of our assessment mechanisms in higher education don't assess what our institutions say they value most. Glancing at even just a few college mission statements, I see none of the following. And I was tempted to actually look at ASU's mission statement before I did this, but in a sense, I don't necessarily want to put the spotlight on your institution in particular. The truth is that no mission statement from any institution that I've ever seen has said any of these things. We pit students and teachers against one another. We rank students in fiercely competitive ways. We measure output with little concern for the learning process. We demean student work by crudely quantifying it. We start from a place of deep suspicion of students. We assess in ways that reinforce bias against marginalized students. And yet, so many of our assessment practices in higher education start from the framework of these kinds of principles. A little bit more data. Food insecurity is a significant factor in determining the average math SAT score. An increase in food insecurity lowers the students' math SAT scores. So when we start talking about quantifying performance, what are we actually quantifying here in this example? In fact, what we're quantifying is the likelihood that a student had experienced food insecurity. Osterk et al. Found that students perform more poorly on exams when they are several weeks removed from receiving food stamp benefits. So in fact, what we might be measuring is how recently had they received their SNAP or food stamp benefits. First generation students performed more poorly compared to continuing generation students only when the function of selection was salient, while no differences appeared in the no selection condition. And in this research, the function of selection was a reminder of the competitive nature of college and that some students are more deserving than others. So that at the point that students are reminded that of the competitive nature of college, first generation students immediately start performing more poorly because they feel like they couldn't possibly be up to the challenge that their fellow students are. There is consensus in the literature about the benefits of a student's sense of belonging. Researchers suggest that higher levels of belonging lead to increases in GPA, academic achievement, and motivation. So your feeling of connection to the community also affects your performance on quantitative measurements. And the last bit of data here, children displayed a statistically significant increase in cortisol level in anticipation of high stakes testing. Large decreases and large increases in cortisol were associated with underperformance on the high stakes test. So the gist there is that stress causes people to perform more poorly. So in fact, what we might be testing for at this moment when we do quantitative or standardized assessment is how much stress a person is feeling, their ability to cope with the stress of this present moment. And this is actually recursive because a student who feels stress might perform poorly, which then causes them to experience more stress. And if we go back to that preschooler who was suspended, which even just the idea of a preschooler being suspended, it throws my brain for a loop. I don't know if it throws your brain for a loop. I don't know what one suspends a preschooler for. But if we go back to that and we think about the stress that might have been caused at that moment and how that ripples out over the course of someone's career, increasing and reinforcing this idea of school as a space of stress. So one last example here about this idea of stress, and I realize I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit with who might show up at an event like this. I hope that none of you are the people who created this particular set of exam instructions for Laurier University. If you are, I'm sorry, because I am not your friend. That will be revealed by what I say about this. So this is text from a 5-page set of instructions for a remotely proctored exam at Laurier University. This is just a small fraction of the pages for these exam instructions, delivered to students in all caps, tiny print, some stuff bolded, some stuff not, hyperlinks linking to other things. And when I looked at this and I saw this being shared online, I was overwhelmed. I felt stress even just looking at the exam instructions, and I wasn't taking the exam. A single page of these exam instructions is bewildering, inscrutable, anxiety-producing, pedagogically bereft. 4 pages, or in this case, there were 5 pages. I only initially saw 4 pages. It's abusive. And so for us to think about the degrees to which our assessment practices might not be effective, but they might actually be abusive. And to whom are they most abusive? Probably, again, that preschooler who was suspended from school, that Black female preschooler. Exam integrity, I would argue, would be better served by 3 words. I trust you. These words have psychological and pedagogical benefits. Students are more likely to cheat when we start off by calling them cheaters. So I'm going to end by talking a little bit about a few assessment practices, which I know that we'll get into in the conversation. These are a few ways that you can approach shifting or moving away from traditional notions of assessment. One of the things I'll say up front is that I don't proselytize as a pedagogue. People might not believe that about me because I'm constantly talking about pedagogy and constantly talking about my approaches and other people's approaches that I see and am inspired by. I think it's important not to proselytize about pedagogy because I think pedagogy, like learning, is super idiosyncratic. How we teach depends on who we are, depends on where we are, the contexts we work in, what bodies that we bring into the classroom. I bring a very particular body into the classroom, which allows me to do certain things in that classroom and engage in certain ways in that classroom. I am a cis, male, gay, sometimes passing, although passing much less often now that I'm married and have an adopted 4-year-old. But that affects and influences how I can engage in the classroom, and also people's roles at institutions. Adjuncts are in a particular precarious place when they're trying to innovate in their approaches. Even where they're allowed to innovate, adjuncts often feel like their job is at threat if they try things that are outside of the status quo. So here's 4 different things that are worth looking more deeply into. Minimal grading. Using scales with fewer gradations to make grading simpler, fairer, clearer. This is from Peter Elbow. He writes about minimal grading. If you Google minimal grading Peter Elbow, this will come up. I like this because it's a way into a conversation. It's a way into exploring how you approach assessment. Because what he writes about is he writes about the arbitrariness of a 97.4. I get a 97.4, Selena gets a 93.2. What is the difference between those 2 grades? What do those grades actually communicate to us about our performance? Very little, aside from the fact that I did better than she did. So grades with lots of gradations, 100-point scales, 1,000-point scales, percentile scales, the only thing that they're good at communicating is ranking students against one another, only good at communicating who performed better than someone else. So he argues for fewer gradations. So if you change nothing else, instead of a 100-point scale, have a 3-point scale, or even a 5-point scale. He also he writes about a 2-point scale, or even the part that I love most about his piece is a 0-point scale, which means that you ask students to do work, but you don't collect it and you don't grade it at all. Students are willing to do a lot of work. I've asked students to do a lot of work over the years that I never collected, and they do the work in many cases because if they're intrinsically motivated to do it. Contract grading, which I'm sure that we'll get into. Grading contracts convey expectations about what is required for each potential grade. Students work toward the grade they want to achieve, and goalposts don't unexpectedly shift. I think one of the key things with any of these approaches is to make sure that you're not setting up shifting goalposts. Because the one thing that is great about standard, God, I can't believe I'm about to say this sentence. Skewer me for it later as we're talking, but the one thing that's great about standardized assessment is the fact that there's a really clear goalpost for students. And if you just say, oh, we're not going to do any grades, and what that means is you just take all the goalposts off the table, what you're doing in many cases is just ending up with invisible goalposts, an invisible set of expectations that students are still held to, but they can't actually see it and they can't engage with it. So finding ways to make sure that the goalposts are clear. I would argue that the best approach is to have students engaged in the process of setting up and establishing their own goalposts. Authentic assessment. So having students do work that has real world audiences. That's one way to approach the idea of authentic assessment. And the thing that I've done most over my career is process letters, self-evaluations, having students write about their own work and having students grade their own work. And I'd say if you're working in a system where you don't necessarily know how to add or approach or innovate in assessment, the one thing that you might consider adding is just having students write about their own learning, whether they grade themselves or not. If you change nothing else, ask students to write about their process and write about their learning. People often say to me, but what if I have a class of 100 or 150? I actually find that this works better and becomes even more necessary in a class of 150, 200, 300. Because if you have 300 students, you can't actually be inside of all of their heads. Well, we can't ever be inside of anyone's head, but you can't even witness their learning or their performance or their successes or their process. And so having students write about it allows you to see what that process is. Even if you're not capable of, if you have 300 students, you're not going to write letters back to every single student, but you might write one letter back to the entire class about all the things that you've noticed. And it will allow you to kind of have a glimpse into who your students are and how they engage and how they work. I'm going to skip a couple slides here. I'm sure this stuff will come up in the conversation. And my slides will be shared after this. So if you want to go back and look at any of these, you will have an opportunity to do that. And I want to end at this I guess, principle that we need to stop having conversations about education without students in the room. We need to have students engaged in thinking about and constructing their own educations. And I think that this definitely holds true for assessment. The most important thing I would say when we're approaching ungrading or alternative assessment is to bring students into a conversation about that assessment. You don't necessarily do it on the first day, because at that point, students are still worried that a rug is going to get pulled out from under them. But week 3, week 4, after you've made a connection, especially online where making those connections becomes harder and harder, having frank conversations with students about how they learn, how they want to be assessed, how it feels when they're assessed. There's a lot of emotion that comes into grading, both when you're receiving grades, but also when you're giving grades. Talking about those emotions is probably the best way to process that. And I'm going to end here. We need more, not fewer, ways to listen for the voices of students reflecting on education. We need more, not fewer, ways to include students in conversations about the future of teaching and learning in college. These conversations cannot begin by sending a signal to students that their voices don't matter. Thank you.
That's great. I have so many questions and comments to make in there, especially about that last part. But let me start with just a couple of questions of my own, then we'll get into some that we and you choose the ones you want. I'm just going to throw a couple of them at you, but I'm also going to throw a couple of observations that I really love. So this is why I really love listening to your talks and the stuff that you put out there. One of the things that one observation I'm noticing about just about every segment of your presentation and how you approach thinking about what does it mean to teach in any classroom, where regardless of how big it is or what kind of subject or what have you, is that your pedagogical approach seems to be to lead with your humanness. I mean, your little word, like start by trusting students. I mean, that's the humanness of your students, and your own humanness only humans can trust. We can't make a machine to do that. It can be programmed for things, but it can't do. So an auto grader is not going to do that for a teacher, to trust students. And I find it interesting that in the end, when you're talking about the magnitude of the scale at which oftentimes remote and other remote learning happens, large classrooms happen where you've got 200, 300 students, trust is central to the function or dysfunction of that classroom, right? And it really shows up in how teachers end up responding, and then it kind of breaks us as teachers, and it breaks students because they feel like the conditions are such that they probably need to turn to cheating or something else. So I'm wondering if you can say I'm curious about your own journey about thinking about did you always have this approach as a teacher to, I need to be human with my students, and that's the only way I can do it, or did you have to come to this realization? The other thing I want to ask about is those goalposts, but let me first ask this, and then I will ask you a question about those goalposts, those standards goalposts.
Yes, I think to some degree. So now I'll get personal. I'll lead with my human in my answer. I grew up in a family of therapists. My mom is a domestic violence treatment counselor. My brother is a social worker working with troubled youth and brain injury patients. And my dad was the drug and alcohol treatment administrator for the state of Colorado. So I'm actually in some ways the black sheep who chose to go into education and not go into psychology. I did double major in psychology. And so that working with the human, I learned so much of who I am as a teacher from watching my parents work, doing group therapy in particular. My dad innovated therapeutic communities for the state of Colorado. So prisoners working together, and he just wrote a piece for a book that's coming out that I'm helping him edit. And ultimately in it, he argues that the prisoners are the best therapists, that the prisoners are better therapists than the therapists when they work together. So he essentially writes about these, essentially self-actualization and these people becoming teachers and teaching themselves. And so I think I've taken some of that approach in my pedagogies just kind of naturally by default. The other thing I'll say, I guess, is that start by trusting students seems easy when I say it. It might seem easy to some people when they hear it, but it's actually really incredibly hard work, because I think so much of our system is built around starting from a place of distrust of students. And also the other thing I've also started saying in other presentations is we also need to start by trusting teachers, because I think so much of our system is also starting from a place of not trusting teachers. And if we look at just the defunding of public education, and we look about how teachers are often demeaned in the media, this trickles down. This trickles down to then the relationships between teachers and students as well. So this idea of pitting teachers and students against one another, ultimately, we need to trust teachers and we need to trust students. And what that looks like is, so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, especially with like a class of 300, is the need to suspend disbelief. Because with 300 people, you can't watch every single one of them at all times. You have to believe that they want to be there and that they want to do the work. If we're only thinking, if only what we see is what matters, we're only seeing a tiny fraction of what's happening for our students. And not just when we have 300 students, but even when we have 20. I mean, think about all the things that are going on in people's brains, all the experiences that they're having, that they're sharing with us or not sharing with us, and how those influence what they do. So I think this idea of kind of suspending disbelief, believing that people want to be there, believing that they want to do the work, believing that when we don't see the work, it's still happening, those kinds of things end up being really important. And the cool thing about those things is they take a lot of emotional labor, but they don't necessarily take a lot of physical labor. So another thing I've taken to saying lately is that trust scales. Trust scales way better than algorithms. It scales incredibly well.
Yeah, you know, and one thing you're making me think about when you talk about your father's innovations with those is and your own teaching, and just thinking about the scaling in large classrooms is first I'm thinking it's the Amazon Raider effect. So I read the study years ago that said all it takes is 3 random Amazon reviewers of a book to get an expert rating on that same book. If you average those 3 together, meaning that if you crowdsource judgments, it actually works out. The more you get, the better off you are going to be in terms of getting a fuller, richer sense. So what you're reminding me of is thinking about a classroom of 300, and if there's only one judge, only one standard maker, only one person who's saying everybody passes through this gate, I'm the gatekeeper, instead of having 300 gatekeepers in a sense that really function very differently now, you miss out on this incredible resource, right? Like, and it sounds like that's what your father's work is doing. Like, maybe it starts with trusting the folks in the circle, if you will, and saying we're all going to have to be therapists together. I don't know. I mean, I'm saying too much about your father's stuff because I don't know for sure, like but it feels like, it sounds like a lot of that. I want to get to some questions. I see that we have. Let me start with the first question that has come up. Let's see. It says, I'll just read it. I am ungrading for the first time this semester. Jumped in with both feet. I've been thinking a lot about how ungrading gives power and autonomy back to students, and that I have to be willing to give up power. I don't find it a struggle, but I know many people might. Any thoughts from Dr. Stommel on this power shift and how to help teachers give up their own control?
Yeah, but gosh, it's a really complicated question because power and control works in bizarre and sometimes disturbing ways inside of institutions. Because if you think about how much power and control does that teacher have, if we're talking about a woman of color who's an adjunct, that person doesn't come into the classroom with all that much power or control. On the other hand, I usually push back whenever anyone argues that somehow students end up having more control than teachers. I think I see students, especially marginalized students, as the least empowered people in our educational system. So anything that we can do to help clear the barricades, clear the hurdles that are in the way of students helps. And it helps both those people feel empowered, but it also is pedagogically effective. I guess the other thing that I will say, and this isn't necessarily to push back on the question itself, is I wonder at this idea of agency and power and the idea of giving agency or power to students. I feel if anything, what our role as teachers is not to empower students, but our role is to sort of clear the barricades and clear the hurdles that are in their way. Because I don't necessarily know that agency is something that I give to someone else. Agency is something that someone else has and that can potentially be taken away from them. So I think rather than my role as being sort of empowering students, I think of my role as advocating for students and being essentially the institution's designated advocate for students. I've been an administrator and I've been a teacher. And in some ways, I think of a teacher as the person who holds space between the institution and the students. They're the advocates who are speaking truth to the power of the institution, whether that's administrators or whether it's or just the system itself. But the teacher ends up being that person who's advocating and holding space between those two things. In some case, beating the institution back, and in another case, advocating directly for the student's needs.
Do you think that it's a good first step or an important step for a teacher to not just pay attention to those power relations that already are operating in the classroom, but to call attention to those with students?
Yeah, I think talking about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think absolutely talking about them, because they don't go away. You don't suddenly snap your fingers and say, whoa, I'm not going to grade. And so all the power dynamics are all just pushed aside. The truth is that there's still the thing that is the seat of the teacher, and it's a seat of power. And it's the only way to address it, I think, is to point to it and say, hey, look, there's a seat of power here. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how it works. And I think Paulo Freire talks about student-teachers and teacher-students. And he's talking about this ability for people in this learning community to move in and out of the seat of the teacher. I think that that's only possible if we talk about that place of power and talk about that seat and talk about how one moves in and out of it. We don't just snap our fingers and say, oh, we're all co-learners here. There is no seat of the teacher. There's no power, because of course there's power. Even in ungrading, I'm still, even if I have my students grade themselves, there's still a Scantron. I'm old enough that I've graded with Scantron. Right. There was still a Scantron, and now a computer something or other, where I bubble in the grade that students gave themselves. And so I still hold that bit of power at that moment. And I think talking about it is the thing that we have to do.
Yeah, and I think for me, I want to add that I think there ought to be visible structures in the class that reassures students that the conversation isn't just a conversation, that we're not just talking about how I'm still in control of the grade as a teacher, but that there's a true negotiation that allows students to be able to enact the agency that they already have, perhaps, but to encourage them, maybe provide some affordances in the classroom that says, let's figure it, let's negotiate what this is going to look like here, and what we all think is fair in this moment, at this moment. I mean, I know you said you don't like to proselytize. I do like to proselytize. I'm all about proselytizing, about pedagogy. And I think grading contracts, especially labor-based ones, are really a very important way to do, especially things like anti-racist work. But you have to do what you were saying before. You said, this is what my notes have, how we teach versus like who we are as teachers. So for me, it feels like that we certainly have to be working on both of those wings, but we often neglect who we are. Like, that is, as a teacher, like what does it mean that I step in the room in terms of my positionality, but also the things I bring and how I come to my students and what I offer them and what they offer me and how I respond to that. So for me, I want to say, like, there's that kind of inner work always needing to happen by teachers. And once we do that, trust starts to happen in magical ways, I think, and other things like that you've been describing. Yeah. Let me, there's another question. We have several, second audience question. We have several questions about anti-racist and decolonial pedagogy. Would you both discuss how a pedagogy of care, and in particular ungrading, results in greater classroom equity? Can you also discuss how anti-racist pedagogy integrates with a pedagogy of care?
Yeah, I want to say one thing, which is that I'm really sensitive to the ways in which some of the pedagogies of care can end up being patronizing. They can presume things about students, and they can presume things about entire classes of students that are it's not necessarily my space to meddle with that. So in some ways, I think that we need to be really careful that care doesn't become a colonizing act. And one of the things that I am really sensitive is to the distinction between something like compassion and empathy. Empathy is a word that I have a lot of trouble with in educational contexts, because it presumes that I can actually feel what you're feeling. And no, I actually can't feel what you're feeling. And I think recognizing and acknowledging that is super important. And so I've really pushed, I can go back to some of my earlier writing and see myself accidentally use the word empathy, or use it without really thinking about what it meant in that context. And I kind of bristle at it, because I feel like something like compassion, showing care as something that I do, not something that I do to you, is an important thing to think about before we even jump into thinking about care.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important thing because I think what you're describing is that it leads, as say, as teachers or even a student in the classroom showing compassion, it leads with our own responsibilities as people, not how we're supposed to feel or what, like, as you said, I think that's a really good distinction between empathy. It's not that we shouldn't try to have empathy, I think, and I don't think you're saying that. But I think it is a trap, right? I mean, empathy is mostly a feeling that teachers might have towards any number of people or students in the classroom. But compassion is a doing. It's a thing, like you said. It's you show what you do. So, and that's the way that in my classroom why we approach that compassion as an anti-racist, as the start of an anti-racist act. So, for instance, if we're going to be anti-racist, we're going to have to be brave. We're going to have to sit with discomfort. We're going to have to sit with conflict, in not just in the way in which we judge each other's languaging, but also in the nature of how the power arrangements in the class get redistributed and realigned. Because they will if we're going to start doing things like introducing different kinds of readings and different kinds of writers in the classroom. So I'm wondering, can you say, I know you don't, I mean, I have my ways, but I want to, I feel like the question that the person was asking about, the audience member was asking about, ungrading as a way towards resulting in greater classroom equity. And I'm sure they're thinking about along various lines, but so you can talk in terms of whichever, any way you want to in terms of equity. I find that I don't know if everyone, in my experience with a lot of teachers, it's that this is a really hard thing because again, it comes back to that question about like we're always in the model of how do I do that, not who am I doing something. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if there is so much inequity in education that we have to deal with, that we have to suss through, that we have to muddle through, that we have to fail a lot before we figure it out, that we have to constantly check ourselves. And essentially, I have over the years started to see grades as just the thing within education that is insidious, that it finds its tendrils into almost everything else. So while I don't think grades or ungrading is by itself, it doesn't by itself constitute an anti-racist pedagogy.
Right.
There's a lot of other work that we have to do in order to get there. I feel like it is one step into having a bunch of serious conversations about how this works in our classrooms. If you feel like you can just remove grades and then you got equity, that doesn't actually work. There's so much else that it reveals about how you engage with students. One of the exercises I like to do with folks is where we pull up our syllabi and we just read it and we talk about the language that we use. We talk about teachery voice and where that teachery voice shows itself. And I've done this exercise where I have us read a sentence from our syllabus and then just punctuate it with "because I said so." And it's fascinating how implicit "because I said so" is in almost everything that we write, in our syllabi, in our course policies, even in course descriptions. And so recognizing that again, the reason students don't feel like they have agency is because with almost every word that we say, we're stripping it from them, or reminding them of the fact that it's been stripped from them. And I think that that's true of, like, I can find this to be true of almost any group of super engaged, empowered, critical pedagogues. We pull up those syllabi, we start talking about the specific language we use, and we start to find how much of that institutional stuff, baggage, has creeped in. And it's true of mine too. I mean, if I pull up my syllabus, I can usually find sentences that I didn't even write. They were taken from the first syllabus that I ever read, that I ever had as a model, and I cut and paste them in. I'm like, every time I revise my syllabus, I read every word, trying to see if I can catch another one of those moments.
Do you find that your students resist or question any of your, like, whether it's your syllabus, your assignments? Do you encourage that in some particular ways? The reason I'm asking this is because again, I want to come back to that idea of conflict as being really necessary in thinking about anti-structural, anti-racist ways of doing work in the classroom. That is allowing for, and I know that one characteristic of white supremacy culture is this sort of paternalistic idea that it's my way, I know what's right, You have to listen. You're the student. There may be lots of reasons to listen to a teacher, but it's not because I know it's right always. And the way you described like reviewing the syllabi suggests a window into finding those places in your syllabus where, oh, wait, I might be reenacting this sort of white supremacist sort of mode of. So I'm wondering if one way around that for me is just to be open to and encourage and ask students for resistance. Like that is to say, so I'm wondering, do you have any of those kinds of things that you do in your classrooms or?
Well, a couple things that I immediately think of. I try and put as much as possible, I try and deliver my syllabus to students or put my syllabus, but even like that, put my syllabus in a place where students are free to comment on it. And then invite them right at the top of the page to comment on it, whether it's in the margins, on the syllabus itself, however it is that their voice can then populate the space of the syllabus. I've also taken over the years, and this was really hard for me because surprisingly, as much as I love play and I'm actually kind of type A about syllabi, I find that structure ends up creating space for play for me. It's kind of like jazz. You have a series, I don't know anything about jazz. I'm not a jazz expert, but I know that you have a very distinct structure that allows for improvisation. It isn't that you just start playing notes willy-nilly. You have a very distinct structure that then you riff around. So I essentially try and create syllabi that are really hyper-structured, but then also making sure that I leave blank space in the syllabus for students to fill. I've started only putting stuff for 5 weeks. And sometimes it's not the first 5 weeks. It might be 2-3 weeks at the beginning and then a couple weeks later, so that there's just empty space. And even if it's me that ends up filling it, that empty space sends a message right from the start. One sentence that I have bolded in my syllabi, or it's actually 2 sentences. You should consider this course a busy work free zone. If an assignment doesn't feel productive, we can find ways to modify, remix, or repurpose the instructions. But just reminders to students that this is your work and I want it to be your work. Some teachers say to me, but gosh, if I just let them do anything, then all kinds of craziness will happen. The truth is that most students don't say, yeah, I want to do something completely different. Most students, though, take that as an opportunity to make small improvisations within their work, and they feel invited to do that. And even just the invitation has a big effect.
Although I want to say, what's so bad about having a crazy class that you get the unexpected? I mean, now again, I'm coming out of a humanities, like you, a humanities, whereas like I'm sure a math professor or a physics professor would go like, there's no way for crazy. Although I would probably respond with like entropy, maybe. Anyway, well, I'm wondering. I want to come back to one thing, and then I want to go to the next question. You mentioned a while back about grades, like taking grades out, ungrading, if you will, in a class isn't necessarily itself an anti-racist pedagogy or practice if you don't do this other work around understanding what that means and how it functions for you as an individual teacher and your students as the ones you have in front of you. So I want to build on that. I want to make go even stronger argument and say that that I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right that it's not necessarily. However, and I'm making an argument for ungrading. I'm making an argument for labor-based grading contracts. I'm making an argument for those things.
Proselytizing again.
I know. However, I can't help it. However, in our higher institutions of higher education, in education, period, grades have always been produced by standards. Those standards have always come from a white, middle class, upper class racial formation in the United States and Europe. Therefore, they reproduce a white language supremacy that just ends up harming more students than helping them. It's not that there's not anything bad about, or that there's bad about those habits themselves, but about using them as a standard, and grades are the mechanism by which we always use them. And then if you use grades, but by judging quality of teachers just doing that, then what you get is that by not doing anything, that's another way of saying, oh, I don't have to ungrade to be anti-racist. Well, be careful is what I'm saying, because if you're using a standard, then probably, and if you're using a standard, where'd you get the standard from? And it's difficult to get a standard from somewhere else. And if you use another standard, you're just replacing one hegemonic system for another one, right? So it becomes so I'm wanting to argue that grades actually are a really important first step in eradicating them. And I think you probably would agree in the education enterprise, period. Like they're just not useful for learning. They're more useful for keeping track of students and doing all that. Like, I want to say panoptic, but you didn't use surveillance is what you were.
Wipe them from the face of the earth. If I could actually do that, that's what I would do. Because they are, I use the word insidious. Earlier in my presentation, I used the word even abusive. I think that I don't think that that's overstatement. When you actually engage with enough students as I have over the years, you hear the feeling language that they associate with testing, with proctoring, with grades, with GPAs, you recognize that abusive is exactly the right word. And I'll just say that I am a physical abuse victim. I very reluctantly just toss the word abuse out because I think that we need to be really careful in using that kind of language. But I do think grades cause physical, emotional harm to students. And so, yes, I would say eradicate them. I think that they're so embedded in our system that it takes a lot of work to get rid of them. So I ultimately think the better first step is to raise our eyebrows at them, to put them on the table and dissect them and talk about what they're doing and talk about how much damage and harm they've done. And so I think we're probably saying the same thing. It's just really kind of a chicken and egg. Like, which do you do first?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it is. It's tackling this problem from two sides or from two different sides. I wonder if you make me think when you're talking, you make me think one really good project for some academics out there. I don't know, somebody out there. I'm thinking high school as well as college, to collect the stories of trauma around grades from students in their own words, to find out exactly the thick, rich extent to which there is real damage and trauma done to students, whether psychologically or whatever, and then see what how that might affect our larger national conversation on what does it mean to have grades in the classroom. I mean, if I know I'm doing something every day in my job that hurts or traumatizes somebody else, even in a tiny way, I don't think I'd want to do that. If I knew that, if I'd proof. So here's another question. We have many questions about institutional roadblocks. A question that encapsulates many of those thoughts from participants is, how do you handle administrative reluctance or roadblocks to enacting these values and practices when you encounter some resistance? And I'm assuming the resistance is from the administrations.
A couple things that I would say about that, and I've said this first bit. This first bit is usually the first thing I say in response to this kind of question, is to say there are probably fewer roadblocks than you think there are. Partly because we internalize so much control from the institution. There's sort of a panoptic, the institution is always watching us, dictating what we do inside of it. So something I do when I'm leading a workshop on grading and someone says, but my institution won't allow me to do that. And I don't do this cheekily or in any sort of mean way. I said, well, let's find out. Let's just pull up the policies at your institution and let's read them word for word. And we'll dissect them as a group and find out what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. I was an adjunct for 10 years of my teaching career. I know about following the letter of the law, even as I betray utterly the spirit of it. And ultimately, I would say, and this leads into my next bit, is that we have a responsibility to not do harm to students. And if there are policies at our institutions, which there are at all of our institutions, policies that do harm, our responsibility as educators, whether we're adjuncts, whoever we are, our responsibility is to either do no harm or do whatever we can to mitigate that harm. That doesn't necessarily mean getting ourselves fired doing that. Honestly, recognizing who we are and what structural power we have is important, but also weighing that really against, well, the institution tells me to do harm. It tells me to do something that causes students trauma. No, at that point, we have to say no, and we have to decide and find out where those moments are that we say no and put our foot down.
Yeah, you're sounding almost like a Thoreau, not wanting to pay his taxes. I'm assuming you pay your taxes.
File an extension.
Okay, let's get to another question. How can institutions better loosen policies to help vulnerable / precarious professors, adjunct, non-tenure track, to support alternative assessment? To put it another way, do you have any thoughts about how the more secure among us can help support and protect our more precarious colleagues when they want to move in these directions for the sake of their students?
Yeah, and that's one of those moments where, to me, there is a problem that is making this system go. And at that point, the problem isn't grades. The problem is the precarious labor problem. And I don't necessarily think we can deal with those at the same time in one fell swoop. We have to put our efforts towards both. Ultimately, we are not going to create a space where faculty, where teachers feel empowered to take risks, to teach, to bring their full self to the classroom, as bell hooks would say. We are not going to create a space where teachers can feel like they do that unless we address the precarious labor problem in higher education. And so ultimately, those are connected to one another. They're part of the same system and they mutually reinforce one another. Asking teachers requiring them to use a learning management system, requiring them to input grades in particularly mechanic, bureaucratic ways. Those all fuel the message to teachers that their voice doesn't matter, that their work doesn't matter, that their agency doesn't matter, that who they are in the classroom doesn't matter. And that's, I think, deeply connected to the precarious labor problem. And I think this is also true of, people often say, well, I'll do this after I'm tenured. The truth is we create a gauntlet within higher education where we make people feel like I can't do this until I have the tenure. Like first, I can't do it until I graduate. As a graduate instructor, I can't do this stuff. And then once they graduate, oh, no, I don't have a job yet. I'm a fellow. Until I have a full-time job, I can't do this. And then once you have a full-time job, nope, can't do this until I have tenure. And then once you have tenure, what has the system done to you by that point? How has it drawn you into the mires of its status quo? And so ultimately, I think we have to find ways to not just start from beginning teachers, but start from the voice of students saying, no, this institution will not do this to me. It will not subject me to a proctored exam where I have to feel embarrassed to go to the bathroom, or where I'm just flat out not allowed to go to the bathroom. My basic human needs, Maslow over Bloom, my basic human needs are what matters here. And so I think I would go back and say that ultimately the professors who have power need to be empowering students to do some of this pushing back.
And I think the thing I will add to that, to your response, is I think that the institution and our current educational systems create an unfair decision for many teachers, especially the more precarious and vulnerable ones, to have to make. That is, I either can be a good teacher, in this case, or I can follow what the system tells me to do so that I can keep my job. And that's a pretty shitty decision to have to make, because ultimately, if you're going to be a martyr and say, no, I'm going to follow my ethics, you could very well get fired. Or you could very well harm your teaching evaluations because your students don't. You're not allowed to contempt or whatever. So I think that it's a divide and conquer mechanism that we have to call out to the institutions, those that matter. So people like me in positions like associate deans and provosts and chairs to say this, because so I think you're absolutely right on that, and we need to. But I think we also have to, even though I know it's so damn unfair. I talk about a version of this dynamic with anti-racist work with teachers and others, and I say, I hate to say it, but the first people across that expanse, the no man's land in that battle, in that race war, they're the ones that are gonna get hurt the most, unfortunately. And that's a really shitty and crappy thing. It's not fair. Nobody should ask that of you, to have to sacrifice your education or your teaching or your career or whatever. But unfortunately, that's where we're at, unless we can create a different way to fight this battle. And I think that you're describing a similar sort of dynamic.
And I guess the one other thing I would say that there are definite, precarity is not distributed equally within education. Some teachers are well more precarious than others. But I think there is also a deeper precarity just to the project and the work of teaching that we need to address and talk about. And I think that comes right down from the federal government with the way that they fund education. Years of austerity culture that have basically said public education doesn't matter, or public education needs to go off and fend for itself. Public education needs to subject itself to the market. That's the message that we've been getting for 30 years in public education. So just, hey, we've got a lot of work to do in these next 30 seconds that we're having this conversation.
Right. So I guess, so we're just about done. This was really, really great. I know there's a lot more questions, I'm sure. Final thoughts before we close, Jesse?
Gosh, final thoughts in 30 seconds. I mean, I would say the one thing that I think is we need to keep having these conversations. And the thing that people keep asking me is like, what do we need to do? What do we need to do post-pandemic? And I remember back in March of last year thinking, we need to be, everyone was talking about the spring and whether classes were going to pivot online and how we were going to deal with grading. And I'm like, stop talking about the spring, start talking about next fall. And then in the summer, people were like, okay, how is the fall going to go? Stop thinking about next fall, the fall. I'm thinking about the following fall. Right now, I'm thinking about like, what is the 5-year roadmap for this? Like, how are we going to make sustainable changes that make sure that the students who were already struggling don't continue to struggle? And that the next time we have a crisis like that, we don't just kick those students under the rug, which is how a lot of them have felt over the last year.
Jesse, I thought you were going to go another direction on that. I thought you were going to say we need to be thinking about now, like what's happening right now. But I think it's a really great balance. It's probably the difference in your perspective and mine in this aspect. I don't think they're disagreeable. But my response would be, and has always been, we always should be thinking about what is happening right now. This is where the damage is happening. Not tomorrow. I mean, it will happen if we keep doing things, but you could stop harm now. You could do good things now, right now. All the learning that's ever happening is happening at this very moment. Learning ain't happening tomorrow. Learning that happened yesterday is already done. So what's happening now? Make those changes or affect those. But it does need a measure of what you're talking about, which is we need to forecast and see what about next fall and have a roadmap. So you're absolutely right. I'm not degrading that. I'm just saying, like, I'm often thinking like, I've only got now. Hell, I don't know if I got tomorrow. I don't know.
Well, gosh, honestly, I don't think we're doing what you're talking about effectively either. I mean, I think we're spending too much time talking about next week or the following week or the following month. Probably if we started talking about today, tomorrow, what can I do to do less harm in my class tomorrow? And then also talking about 5 years into the future. Maybe it's this middle that we get stuck in of trying to do strategic planning for the next year. And I'm like, strategic planning at most institutions will take you the entirety of the next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, for me, I think too much, and I understand the importance in it, but too much conversation or too much planning is around increasing enrollments or maintaining enrollments or retention. You know what makes good retention? Really great learning experiences. And really good teachers.
Honestly, just being kind to people, being human, being a human being. That's how that's how we retain. Like, think about how we build relationships with one another. We are kind, compassionate, good, human. That's how we maintain relationships. A university is a collection of relationships. It's not about retaining, market capital, yada, yada.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think it does lead to similar outcomes, although the focusing of how we get there is different. I don't want to, in one sense, I want to say, I don't want to run there. I don't want to get in a car. I want to walk. I want to walk there and enjoy the entire process. The only way for me to enjoy it is for me to feel good about how I go about doing that teaching enterprise and how I go about having those exactly the relationships you're talking about with students. Yeah. That's like 90% of what I understand my job is like cultivating and crafting and what do I want to say? Like nurturing relationships with students and my colleagues. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much, Jesse. It's been, as usual, really, really engaging. And I got a ton of notes. I'm thinking you always make me rethink a few things in what I do, but I'm not going to rethink the proselytizing thing. So I'm going to continue to proselytize.
I'm happy to proselytize for you.
Okay.
So
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in to thank Dr. Stommel and Inouye for your conversation and presentation today. And I really hope that this can live on to be a resource for educators in our community and everywhere I just want to thank everyone who was able to join us today. We did receive over 50 questions in the Q&A, so we apologize that we couldn't get to all of those, but maybe next time we'll have more time. And we hope you'll consider joining us for our next major event, our 2021 IHR Distinguished Lecture with Adrienne Marie Brown. That will be on March 25th. You can register for that event and others at ihr.asu.edu/events. And if you want to share today's event with your friends or colleagues, it's saved on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/IHRASU. Thank you everyone again, and we'll see you next time.